Welcome to our roundtable discussion. We are talking about a topic today that could be sensitive for some people. The reason why we're talking about it is because some events that have happened recently, all the way back to January after the election, and it's dealing with some perspectives and ideologies that people have, some in the church, and we felt it's something that we need to talk about as Christians. We certainly want to talk about it from a biblical foundation. So I'm Rich Powell, pastor of Grace Bible Church, and Bobby Locklear is our pastor of small groups. And our guest today is Joshua Spencer, and he's a chaplain in the North Carolina Guard. And so we're glad to have him along with us today and his perspective on this. So the topic is Christian nationalism. And I think before we get into that, the first thing we need to do is define that. So what is Christian nationalism? Probably a lot of people have very different definitions about what this is. Some think it's a really awful thing. Some think, there might be some good in it. So I'm just going to kind of ask the questions and you guys get to talk, all right? So Bobby, we'll start with you. Give us a definition of what are we talking about in Christian nationalism?
So I did observe in reading 3 or 4 articles as people were trying to get wrapped around what exactly that is. It's like it's the kind of thing that you don't necessarily have people that are like, that's me, okay? That I'm the Christian nationalist. That being said, you can make some observations, and it's like if you cast the net too wide, then you're going to include some people that are in very different camps, okay? And if you cast it too narrowly, you're going to miss some commonalities there. I did like Paul Miller, the sociologist that wrote for Christianity Today, had just observed that Christian nationalism, the belief that the American nation is defined by Christianity and that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. And he kind of like distinguishes between nationalism on the one hand and like patriotism. So nationalism is a kind of way of defining what the country is.
Right.
And then it's kind of intertwined with how Christians understand their Christian identity and their American identity is kind of overlapping.
Okay.
So in a way that he's saying is not helpful.
So it's an ideology, it's a political ideology essentially is what he's saying there, what you're defining as.
I guess the word ideology, I'm thinking of how that.
I mean, it's how they would define America, right?
Yeah.
America's a Christian nation.
Yeah, identity.
In the government.
Yeah,
so it's like an identity.
Which informs how they're thinking about their political involvement, their relationship.
And if the government should take steps to protect America as a Christian nation, that in itself becomes a political ideology.
Yeah.
All right.
Without question, yeah.
Okay. So Joshua, define Christian nationalism.
As you two have both identified, I think the trouble is that there's a lot of perspectives, and those perspectives stem from the combination of these two words. What is a Christian? That could be hard to define for some people. What is nationalism? That can be hard to define. Are either of those things good or bad on their own merits? Not everyone thinks that Christianity is good. A lot of folks don't think nationalism is good. Stick them together. Do we double down? Do we create a third monster?
So let me interrupt you there. How would you differentiate between patriotism and nationalism?
Sure. Right, and there's another one of those things. Some people see any patriotism as simple jingoism. Other ones think that, no, a healthy love for your homeland and the desire to support and to protect it is a good thing. Of course, all of this is tied to historical narratives. If you see America as an essentially good thing, an imperfect idea, and people that has over time grown in its maturity closer toward that more perfect union that was envisioned in documents like the Constitution, then you see America as a good thing and wanting to protect and build that, patriotically supporting that, you see that as a good thing. If on the other hand you see America as a fundamentally oppressive narrative, well then that's not really something you want to stick up for or be proud of. And so I think before you can even start talking about terms and whether or not the things are good or bad, you end up having this, this meta narrative that overhangs the whole thing, and depending on which narrative you buy into fuels your whole perception of these two terms individually and how they work together. The other day I saw an article, a friend forwarded it to me, outlining how over the last several decades there was a drop in religious identification among Americans from something like 70% decades ago to I think 47% was the figure cited today. And a detail that's problematic was, it said it was from 70% to 47% of those who attend church, mosque, or synagogue. combining Christians, Jewish folks, and Muslims all in the same bucket. But the problem is that Jews and Muslims collectively only account for, 2.9% of the American population. So when we say 47% go to church, mosque, or synagogue, what we mean is 44% go to church, and less than 1/10 of that number are in another category. That's further complicated by the fact that you have about the same number of Hindus and Buddhists also in America. So if we're broadening this concept to religion in America in general, what we're really talking about is over 90% of it is Christianity. So, whatever the religious nationalism or religious connection there is to America and whether the government should be involved in religious affairs, we talk in these broad terms, but it really is a specifically Christian thing. Go back to the founding fathers. What is a Christian nation? Can a nation be Christian? To me, this is the same problem as Christian music. Can music believe that Jesus died for them and invite him into their hearts? And the answer is, well, no. So what do we mean by Christian? The government isn't Christian. Not all the people are Christian. The documents aren't Christian documents. So what does it mean to be a Christian nation?
If you were to take a tour through Washington, D.C., right, and you look at all the monuments of the founding fathers, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, the Lincoln Memorial, and all of that, even in some of the museums, there is so much actual scripture there, right? And so you walk through that and you would think, okay, these are some of the founding principles of this country, and these are all from the Bible, right? And so some people would say, well, this is a Christian nation. Well, is it really a Christian nation? And are we to expect the government to keep this a Christian nation? Because we're going to be having a seminar on religious liberty, so that's a different topic. But the whole idea of Christian nationalism, give us a definition of what you would see Christian nationalism to be, good or bad.
So I think that as a matter of historical fact, it can be demonstrated in the literature of the time that all of the people who were involved with the founding of this country, the vast majority of them were religious observers of some sort, the vast majority of those being Christians, and that they definitely infused the founding documents and ideas of the country with a lot of Christian ideas. And even though I think that it was something like 10% of Americans actually attended church during the American Revolutionary period of the 1760s and 1770s, which is a small minority, nevertheless, you do have the Great Awakenings, and so Christianity has obtained a lot of cultural influence just among the populace, regardless of the founding fathers. So there's no doubt that Christianity has been the biggest influencing religion in America, but whether or not we are a Christian nation ever, I don't think has been established. For those who want to make America a Christian nation, do we mean anything besides, we would really like to share the gospel with everyone and everyone to come to faith in Christ? Because I'd love to see that. Or do we mean that we want to establish some sort of theocracy where the government is mandating Christian ideas? And then by Christian ideas, do we mean moral principles, like we might talk about abortion, or do we mean mandating things like church attendance and observation of specific things like you would see in, say, Puritan New England? So again, I hesitate to define this because I don't know that there is any agreement on what it means. If you mean theocracy, no, I think that's a bad thing, and I think that scares people.
So the definition that is given here that Bobby gave, to define America is defined by Christianity. Is America defined by Christianity? First of all, that's the question. And the government should take active steps to keep it that way. Wouldn't that, if that is Christian nationalism, that's not necessarily a positive thing, because that would marginalize people of all other faiths. That would make them kind of a second-class citizen, right?
I don't think necessarily. I mean, you look even back to the same largely Christian founding fathers and the documents. Religious liberty is the very first amendment enshrined to be protected under constitutional law. So when they speak of religious diversity, they're typically talking about different Christian denominations, but Jews were also included at that time. If 47% of Christians today are still attending church on a regular basis, define regular, I think that's monthly or at least several times a year. Okay, but if almost half the populace is still largely influenced by Christianity, and the government we all live under is still operating by the same rules that are still largely influenced by the Christian progenitors, then I mean, what does that mean? We're still a largely Christian nation, at least culturally. Whether or not we pay lip service to that, those moral and theological roots still underpin a lot of our worldview.
Yeah. Well, we are certainly reaping the benefits of principles that arise out of the Judeo-Christian worldview, right? And that is a part of the founding of the country, so we're still reaping benefit from that. But as we go along, now definitions are being changed, the definition of certain institutions are being changed. And that is fundamentally changing the whole idea of, are we a Christian nation? I don't think we're a Christian nation, but we do have founding principles that are very much in line with biblical truth, right? So we would want to defend that. However, at the same time, if I see my neighbor who is behaving in a way that is not biblically accurate, should I pursue legislation to force them to do what I think they ought to be doing?
We have no biblical warrant for that.
No biblical warrant for that at all. And that's how some people would see Christian nationalism to be. Yep. We're a Christian nation, and you're acting very anti-American. So,
yeah, and that's the thing. It's like mapping the American civic life and Christian experience, mapping them onto one another, even if they look very different in certain ways. You know, whether it's your opinions about tax law or traffic. I mean, any of these opinions, and you're like, there's a kind of Christian position on this. That's where it starts to become a bit of a problem. And as you see, acknowledging the cultural influence of Christianity as it was, and then seeing that at least, at minimum, you could be like that there is a large part of the population in this country that would be very uncomfortable saying that America was a Christian nation. So then given that, what do you do with that change in deference? And so if, as we read of influencers that are saying that cultural ascendancy needs to remain, we need to be explicit about saying that America is a Christian country and this is the way that that looks, that is where it starts to look like are we mapping the interest of, say, like a political party, a political movement onto what the church is to be about, and allowing, it's kind of like, are we losing who's driving this bus eventually? And so that's where you can have a certain kind of narrative. We can talk about all of the founding fathers as devout Christians or something, and that's a kind of narrative that doesn't meet well with history. And then it also can drive political action today in such a way that we're like, that we're broad brushing in some ways to carry on a part of a movement that we're a part of today.
Let's talk about a couple of biblical texts that are relevant to the discussion. First of all, when it comes to, is Christianity being hijacked by a political party?
Yeah.
Honestly, both of the two major parties in America do this to some extent. One side favoring more the idea of justice and equity, which is sort of a major theme into the Old Testament prophets. The other side emphasizing ideas more like personal responsibility, which is also an idea that's throughout the Bible. So you can ground both concepts of the political parties somewhere in Christianity, but you can't have that particular cart in front of that particular horse. Okay, as Christians, our political worldview has to be driven by our theology and not the other way around. And that's a concern for me. And the Bible can't be put into that mold. For example, think of where Paul says, everyone has to look to his own interests. And then he also says everyone has to look out for the person next to him too. There's a contradiction there. Well, am I looking out for me or am I looking out for you? And the answer is we're all supposed to do both. And there is a contradiction, a tension between those two responsibilities. And the Bible doesn't resolve it too easily. The other one I would think of has to do with the very last chapter in Revelation. The angel speaks to John at the very end of the book of Revelation, and he says, the words of this book you're supposed to hold forth. And whoever is holy, let him continue to be holy. And whoever is unrighteous, let him continue to be unrighteous. And I remember the first time that passage clicked for me, I was like, what do you mean, let them continue to do those things? And the answer is, you don't have the power. And even if you did, it wouldn't be your responsibility. You can't force people to believe these things or do the right thing. And so no, there should be no compulsion from a realist perspective of, do we want the government to enforce a Christian way of doing things? And the answer is, well, no, you can't make them do things. Well, what does the government do? Romans chapter 13. It's there to execute justice on those who do evil. And so for me, the government, from a biblical perspective, seems to have more of a restrictive role in preventing evil from being done, more than trying to force onto people a Christian worldview.
So in that sense, let's take a particular issue, for example, abortion, right? We believe that is the slaughter of innocent life. And yet that is, by the government, that is a protected right, right? And we would argue that that should not be. So how are we approaching that? Is that nationalism to say, is that Christian nationalism to say that the Supreme Court ought to reverse Roe versus Wade?
That's the tricky part, right? Because no matter what you do, all politics are driven by moral assumptions or views of the world. Right. And if you are a Christian, the moral worldview from which I'm coming is going to be a biblical worldview. And so my moral vote is going to be reflective of that. So yeah, it's very easy for someone to look at me as a Christian and say, I am against position X, in this case, abortion, and say, well, you're just bringing your religion into the political debate, to which I answer,
who isn't?
All morality is ultimately grounded in your view of theology, and all politics flow from worldview. To say otherwise is to pretend that something is real that just isn't the case. It's just entirely disingenuous.
Okay, so so nationalism, let's make a distinction between nationalism and patriotism. We love our country, that's like rooting for the home team, right?
Right.
So nationalism, is there something positive about nationalism, or is it the same thing as patriotism?
Yeah, in my experience, I've always perceived nationalism to be very similar to patriotism, but I don't think it has that connotation for everyone.
Right.
So if we're going to draw a distinction, especially in the current political climate with nationalism having a negative flavor, maybe we could say that nationalism is the idea that our country is the best over and against everyone else, even at their expense, whereas patriotism is more of, I love where I come from. It's kind of the difference that, like, there's pride and there's pride, right? There's pride as in I feel great satisfaction in the legitimately good things that I have accomplished, versus pride in a more satanic sense of I am the center of my own moral worldview. Nationalism is more like we are the center, we are the most important, whereas patriotism is more of a love born out of good things.
Nationalism can tend to have these connotations of self-preservation, or we're kind of protectionist, like there's a bit of anxiety about outside influence and purity. Keeping these outside influences out, and you see the disputes kind of boiling over into either international conflict, immigration, this kind of thing, where nationalism can take patriotic ideals to a place in which it is there's a unhealthy, or at least unrealistic, view of preservation of a particular culture within American experiment.
If we're thinking of patriotism primarily as born out of love, and nationalism is primarily born out of either arrogance or fear, that makes it easier to classify in a moral sense. Yeah. And sure, any love that is inordinate can become its own evil. Yeah. And so maybe there's a sense in which a Christian can be patriotic. Think of Jeremiah and talking to the Jews who are in exile to be supportive of the city that they find themselves in. We are not ultimately citizens of this kingdom, we are citizens of a heavenly kingdom, but to the extent that we are in this world and not of it, we are to be supportive and helpful and loving. But if that love becomes inordinate and an idol in itself, and it ends up being this conceited, arrogant emphasis of ourself extended to the borders of our country, then yes, maybe it becomes a bad kind of nationalism.
And I think that's where the clear difference is between Christian nationalism and just good patriotism by Christians. Right?
Yeah.
We love our country, because it can become an idol to us, and we need to be very, very careful. John's last words, little children, keep yourselves from idols. Yeah. One of those might be, conflating or confusing or confounding the lower kingdom with the higher kingdom, right? And assuming that we can accomplish the principles of the higher kingdom by the operations of the lower kingdom, right? So the pitfalls, continuing on here, the potential pitfalls of Christian nationalism. Let's go back to January 6th, the raid on the U.S. Capitol, right? That's what they're calling it. And there was a lot of Christian symbols there, a lot of Christian symbols. And one man got up in the speaker's desk, right, and he prayed this public prayer, right, as invoking God's name. I'd say most people would see that as that's what Christian nationalism is. That we are a Christian country, and we are going to do everything we can to ensure that the government maintains this country as a Christian country. And therefore, this is what it takes. And those people, probably some of them, felt very justified in what they were doing, even though it was very much an illegal act, right? So, pitfalls. Is that what Christian nationalism is, Bobby? Is that how you see it? Is that how we should see it? Or is that a fringe, radicalized, if you will, marginal segment?
But if you think of then, like, what actually happened there, and then conversation with people that are like, I'm totally okay with what happened and how it happened and the mentality supporting these actions. And where the rubber hits the road is, like, viscerally, are the successes and failures of your political movement, whether it's a party or otherwise, is that is that what keeps you up at night, or is it the successes and failures of what's going on in the kingdom? And it's like that. If you mentioned the two tiers here, if our primary citizenship is in heaven, and it's like what grabs our attention is first and foremost what the Supreme Court is or is not doing, what my political party is or is not doing, and whether my political opponents recognize this or that. And that is what is, if that is driving you, and you see the success or failure of your effort as the success or failure of the gospel, it's delusion. It is a identification that we have no grounds biblically for. And so that's where it's like, now whether you have that isolated, because you can find a lot of articles about Christian nationalism before January 6th, right? I mean, right. So people writing about this, even going back to the George Bush era. I mean, so it's like concerns about theocracy or this kind of thing. So it's like this is an abiding concern for people all over the spectrum in American politics. But it's like, to any extent to where whatever your favorite political candidate is, if your hopes and fears are invested in that person's success, then you are committing this mistake.
So we could say that nationalism, in that sense, and there's a lot written about it, but probably in very few people's understanding is there more of a overt manifestation of Christian nationalism than what happened.
And that Jericho march
right?
just like a month before, it's just some really weird stuff going on.
And so nationalism, that Christian nationalism particularly, would be more about protecting our way of life, protecting what we're used to in our culture, and protecting our way of life. Because I've heard it said that some people think Christians are more interested in fighting for their rights than they are about laying down their lives. Well, that certainly isn't the fragrance of Christ, right? And so that's where I think the big danger is, the big potential pitfall is. What was the driving force there in the Jericho March, the driving force January 6th? What is it that we want to preserve? What is it that we want to promote? Is it truly the gospel of Christ, or is it our way of life? Or what would you say to that?
Yeah, let's add one more dimension to all that, because I agree with everything you're saying. Again, this is a cart and horse thing. The cross, the gospel, must be our primary concern. The kingdom of heaven is our primary concern. And I think we need to be better known for laying down our lives and our rights rather than simply shooting at other people, metaphorically or otherwise, in defense of them. However, a couple of things. One, on January 6th, a prayer was said, but just after that, there was that whole situation where the congressperson prayed amen and a woman from the same floor, right? So prayers are happening from that chamber, and no one's complaining about Christian nationalism because someone said a prayer. So I don't know that the fact that a guy got up there in front of the Senate building and said something in the name of Jesus automatically ties whatever happened there to Christian nationalism, although I understand that there are those who feel that way. I don't think that's enough to establish that.
It's not so much the prayer, but it's the raid in there, people going in there and then him, saying that prayer, ostensibly invoking God while he's committing an illegal act.
Sure, and while I would hesitate to use terms like raid, I would say, sure, the symbolic act of doing what was done in the violation of that property is, speaking more as an American than a Christian here, borderline sacrilegious, okay? So I understand why many are upset, but on the other hand, I don't want to over-dramatize it for political reasons. On the other hand, I think it's important to not concede the moral ground too much, because on the one hand, any moral belief that we have is going to come out in our speech. And as long as we are allowed the free speech of things like voting and assembly and worship, if we are going to be asked about, hey, what do you think about candidate X? This is their position on something like abortion. If I have a moral view on something like abortion, to use the previous example, simply speaking the truth means that's the person I'll vote for. Now, I don't mean to get into the technicalities and complexities of Republican versus Democrat and manipulating those moral perspectives. But again, as we said, your moral worldview is going to come out in your vote. And if there's a candidate to vote for, our moral worldview emphasizes the divine image of God in each person, and therefore the sacred value of every single human life. And if we concede that ground, even in a political vote, what we're simply saying is, well, we say that we believe this, but it's not important enough to speak the truth about, even in the way that we vote. So on the one hand, no, we don't want to be fighting for our rights and not laying down our lives, but then is the opposite to just say, sure, we'll just let whatever happen in the political sphere despite the moral implications. So for me, the tension is, how do we do that but in a way that smells like the fragrance of Christ, and not in a way that is, violent or scary or arrogant or closed-minded or assign whatever adjective you want to.
And that's the real practical question of what we do in the face of. We see excesses and we see commitments that we know cannot be justified biblically, and also we see over-identification with a flesh and blood kingdom. Okay, is the only alternative just pendulum swing retreat, complete retreat from societal interaction? That's where it's just we need more biblical imagination.
Yeah.
It's just like as a people, and part of it is that at every point you look, all of these conversations are seen at a national level, at the level at which you and I have very little, if any, influence, right? And it's we're further and further removed from just the local context that we have. And if there's any way Christians can push back against the constant pressure, we read about what's going on in Venezuela or Colorado or Florida, and it's like, well, what about what's going on right here in the city that God has put me in? And how can I be involved politically in that context? And so I pick around, it's like, you should be allowed to have political influence if you know who's on your local school board or something. Because there's a place in which you actually have influence and can be involved in shaping your local context for good. And that's slow and that's tedious and it's harder to see.
And I think you're touching on something there, because I think to a degree the Christian nationalism is, as long as we have our guy in the White House, things are going to be okay in the country. Yeah. Well, that's the farthest thing from the truth, right? Yeah. You have all of the legislature, but you have all local government as well, too. Yeah. Yeah. Not to mention, you've got the main influencers in the country, which is your educational systems and media, right? Yeah. And those are a huge influence. And so what is our role as citizens of the kingdom of heaven? Yeah. Right? What is our role in influencing this country in a positive way for the sake of Christ? And not just resorting to politics as if that's the only answer. Because truly, in a country that is where the government is of the people and by the people and for the people, then truly you can say that the government reflects the people. And if you're going to change the government, if you want to change the country, you're not just going to do it by changing the government. You have to see where the people are changing, right? People's hearts and minds, their attitudes, their thoughts are changing. Right. And that's the mission of the church. But we're not doing it for the sake of having a better country. Yeah. We're doing it for the sake of Christ.
And we can feel like we're actually changing things by our activity on social media, that's one of the delusions that we can put ourselves under by saying that, look, I learn about these things and I'm speaking out about this or that issue, and that's bringing about real world change. But the real world change comes from those difficult conversations with family members that you don't necessarily share beliefs, your neighbor that you and those. In your church context, those are the real world places where change actually happens, where we can actually listen to and hear someone else, because often we don't actually know what it is that our neighbor believes.
And see, that's the problem. We can be so much broad stroking here, and I see this this is played out in theological circles as well, right? What this can cause. You're talking about the potential pitfalls of Christian nationalism, right? And it can cause unnecessary division, right? Because we don't truly understand how other people are thinking. We just assume they think like we do, right? And so we can't do that anymore. And we don't really know how people are thinking, but we're not willing to understand how they're thinking or what their worldview is. And so we can create this unnecessary. We do this in theological circles, right? If I am of this theological framework and you're of this theological framework, and the person who understands this theological framework by red herrings and straw men, right? And therefore they say, well, you just don't know the Bible, or you just don't know God, right? And so we broad stroke them with labels. And the same thing happens politically. And so it causes an unnecessary division among people instead of truly trying to understand how the other person thinks.
I know folks, pastors, who were present at some of the protests and some of the riots as well that occurred largely over last summer for the sort of, let's just put it under the umbrella of civil rights issues that were central to primarily liberal political concerns last summer. And I know Christians and pastors who are present in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, who are, on the opposite side of the spectrum. I support the freedom for both folks on both sides to support, to express their views and their concerns. I think that both sides are frustrated at the way they often get portrayed by folks on the other side of the aisle. Right. And I think, to your point, this is especially bad when it's fellow Christians who aren't just divided over theological issues, they're divided over political issues. Not everyone who was there, in fact, a minority of the folks who were there on January 6th were the ones who went into the Capitol building. Does that mean that everyone else who was there, who was concerned about the election and wanted every legal recourse to be taken and or protest the election of a new president? That's their right as Americans to do so, whether or not you agree with them. Now, for those who broke the law and incited violence, that's a whole separate thing. But can you characterize the whole for the part of the few? And same thing on the other side. Everyone who looks at the BLM protest last summer and says, hey, there's some folks who are concerned about civil rights. There are also some really bad things that were going on there. Can we say that literally everyone who's concerned about civil rights is automatically, Antifa or even more extreme than that? And the answer is no, it's unfair to do. So I say, let's have a lot of grace toward each other, rooted in focusing on the first things first, not neglecting the lesser concerns like national politics or local politics, but focusing on our commonality in Christ and having those conversations to understand each other and focusing on who really matters in all this.
Good. Last words, Bobby?
Nope. Yeah. Attending to where we get information, I think, is another thing too. The last part you said about doing these kinds of conversations with brothers and sisters, it's like face-to-face interactions are pivotal for how we're informed and what is actually shaping our expectations for the world we live in. And so it's not enough to say we are citizens of this kingdom. Okay, now let's do life. We need to see the real world impact of being a citizen of that kingdom, and that will show itself in our media habits and the ways in which the institutions that we belong to, family, church.
Certainly, we need to keep the big picture in view. The big picture that God grants us, right? And because if it all becomes about our nation, then we become a bit myopic that way, and we lose our sense of mission, and we lose the big picture, and then we start adopting the behaviors and characteristics of the people of that lower kingdom who don't know God. And I think that's probably one of the biggest dangers of what we might call Christian nationalism. But we love our country, and we want to defend it, and we want to promote what is right and godly in our country.
With gratitude.
Gratitude, absolutely.
And with grace.
And with grace. So very good. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time and for your input in this, and I hope this has been helpful, and we look forward to another discussion next time. Thank you.